This is a crucial aspect of mass incarceration that psychoanalysis helps us to appreciate. Punishment operated not just to deprive pleasure, but also to cause pain by depriving people of developmental opportunities to heal, to grow, or repair. The cruelty of this cannot be underestimated, especially considering what we know about the wrecking effects that trauma has and untreated trauma has on generations. I work mostly with people who have served life sentences now, and it's really interesting to listen to the ways that they figured out how to put opportunities for themselves together in prison over decades to find ways to be able to grow. That like this drive to figure out like how they had found themselves in that situation was so strong that they would, you know, like cobble together anything they could find. I remember this one guy I worked with was in the hole for like 10 years and just read the interpretation of dreams like over and over and over again, trying to do this self-analysis. Okay, so since the United States now incarcerates more people than any other country in the world, and since we failed to actually get tough on crime, I always wish somebody would run on a tough on crime platform like universal healthcare, preschool for all, living wages. We now must ask about mass incarceration,
Listening.
what philosopher
Oh.
Michel Foucault once asked about the prison reforms of the 19th century. He said,
incarceration.
Since maybe somebody can find their mute button. Since the proclamation of the failure of the prison has always been accompanied by its maintenance, one should reverse the problem and ask oneself, what is served by the failure of the prison? What is the use of these different phenomena that are continually being criticized? The maintenance of delinquency, the encouragement of recidivism, the transformation of the occasional offender into a habitual delinquent, the organization of a closed milieu of delinquency. So this idea of reversing the question and asking what's served by a symptom is such a hallmark of psychoanalytic thinking. So let's see what that has to offer us. Okay, does anybody have any questions or comments or anything?
I haven't gotten any questions in the chat. Does anyone want to ask a question at this time? Okay, then I just guess we'll just keep going. Oh, okay, folks, great. Just in case, the chat is in the on your lower screen in the middle. Just hit the chat button and it will show you how to send a message. Okay, Beth.
Okay. All right. Okay. Okay. Legal scholar Ian Haney Lopez argues that amid the cultural changes described earlier, quote, mass incarceration took on a life of its own, gaining legitimacy as a seemingly obvious framework for managing diverse problems and eventually permeating our social architecture, metaphorically, but also literally, end quote. As I hope I've made clear, the solution that emerged was not one of just being punitive towards people who were violent or caused harm to others. Corporations that endangered the welfare of their workers to increase profit margins weren't criminalized. Spaces known for increased sexual violence, like college fraternities, weren't increasingly policed. And lawmakers didn't get tough on white-collar industry practices that normalized annual bonuses of millions and millions of dollars for handfuls of individuals at the expense of living wages or like healthcare for thousands and thousands of others. This seemingly obvious framework was to locate particular kinds of danger in particular groups of people. Psychoanalysis invites us to consider how and why this occurred by becoming curious about how, in the words of analyst Robert Young, certain public values and structures got into the unconscious before they got projected and rationalized as the public interest. The idea that we project onto others our undesirable characteristics isn't new, nor is the idea that we construct others for this very purpose. But what I'm suggesting, and what I hope furthers our understanding of mass incarceration and this mass punishment, is that we're doing something more nefarious than just projecting onto others. We're coercing people into identifying with those projections by creating and maintaining social conditions that are traumatogenic, conditions that nudge certain individuals and certain groups of people into actions that we then criminalize. I'm arguing that this seemingly obvious framework emerged to manage our collective anxieties related to the dangers inherent in the founding forces around race and wealth in this country. In the 1940s, analyst Melanie Klein first developed the idea of projective identification. Thomas Ogden, a contemporary analyst, defines it as an effort to change the other person, not simply one's view of the other person. So that's kind of how it's different than just projection. He continues, this psychological interpersonal process entails effort to actualize the projective fantasy in the sphere of interpersonal reality. In other words, unconscious fantasies are actualized by the evocation of congruent feelings in another person. So projective identification, I feel like is one of those things that hard to explain, but once you understand it, it's like, yes. So I always think about it as like when someone is, like really hurt your feelings or made you upset and you've like talked to 10 of your friends and finally work up the nerve to talk to them. And then you leave the conversation being like, oh my God, I'm the asshole. Like, what? And then you talk to your friends again and you're like, wait, what happened to all the things that I was going to say to the person, right? Like, it's this way that we have of kind of transmitting parts of our own experiences into that of other people. Okay. So people use it to mean slightly different things. I'm using it here today for us to think about projective identification as a defense mechanism, a way that we have of getting rid of parts of our own unconscious experience by kind of nudging other people to experience them instead. So again, Thomas Ogden, he breaks this theoretically complex idea down into 3 steps. The first step must be understood in terms of wishes to rid oneself of a part of the self. In the second phase, the projector exerts pressure on the recipient to experience himself and behave in a way congruent with the unconscious projected fantasy. In the third step, the recipient experiences himself in part as he is pictured in the projected fantasy. Clinicians and theorists often find projective identification to be useful because, unlike other psychoanalytic ideas, it bridges 2 registers, the intrapsychic and the interpersonal. So today I'm using it in the tradition of analysts like Isabel Menzies Life, and using it to think about not just an intrapsychic interpersonal process, but also a social level one. Okay, so I'm just going to take each of these steps and how we can think about mass incarceration. The first step, so what parts of our collective self might we want to be rid of? One need only look at the people that we dispose of in our prisons to begin to answer that question. They're mostly people who are poor and people of color, namely Black, Latinx, and Native. Since the explanatory power of eugenics has been thoroughly debunked, this must be symptomatic of something besides their own actions. Psychoanalysis tells us that we repeat what we cannot remember. Scholar DeJoy Groy's work on post-traumatic slave disorder argues that as a country, we haven't allowed ourselves to truly know the trauma of slavery, colonization, and the violence upon which this country was founded. We are thus destined to reenact it until we do. Sociologist Loic Vaquan argues that the hyper-incarceration of Black people serves an extra penological function, that is to keep them in subordinated social positions, much like other peculiar institutions like slavery, Jim Crow, and the creation of socio-spatial conditions in the traditions of ghettos. Though, he says, though the punitive management of poverty is a crucial component of neoliberalism, it's also raced. A 1-2 punch, he continues, the carceral continuum that entraps a population of younger Black men also plays a pivotal role in the remaking of race by making Black men into criminals and substituting social welfare with penal management, end quote. This is a fascinating and almost unbelievable reversal. It's been white people, and in particular white people with wealth, who have perpetrated atrocities on millions of Black and Indigenous people for centuries. Why is danger not located and then controlled there? Psychoanalysis also tells us that dependency and interdependency are innate aspects of our humanity. Yet under neoliberalism, the odds are better for some only because they are worse for others. Over the past 40 years, concurrent with ballooning incarceration rates, neoliberalism, in the words of scholar Wendy Brown, has been exhaustively configuring human beings as market actors, always, only, and everywhere, end quote. In her language, this financialization of everything requires disavowal. Unlike even capitalism that still allows for some needs to be met by government, neoliberalism works to commodify all aspects of life and make basic everyday needs into products that are afforded by few despite needed by many. As psychoanalyst Lynn Layton argues, these conditions require us to compete all the time in almost all aspects of life to secure needed goods whose value rely on their scarcity. She says, fear is constantly stoked, yet vulnerability is deemed shameful. By eroding empathic capacities that would otherwise allow us to see that we are mutually implicated, and as analyst Rachel Pelt says, perhaps experiencing the shared loss of a holding environment by a neoliberal government, privilege is pitted against precariousness. Neoliberalism transforms our relational needs into liabilities, simultaneously creating conditions of precarity and attributing their effects to individual character defects is a core feature of neoliberalism. If you're poor, it's because you haven't worked hard enough. If you're mentally ill, it's because you haven't worked hard enough. If you're homeless, you definitely aren't working hard enough. Further criminalizing the adaptations that people must make to these conditions resolves any ambivalence we might have about them. Once criminals, they are no longer us. We are to be protected from them, not working together to protect them from conditions that can harm us all. This double helix of race and class in this country is located in our prisons because the anxieties of both are located in our history and thus in all of us. Writer Ta-Nehisi Coates states that, quote, race is the child of racism, not the father. Perhaps too, mass incarceration is the child of mass perpetration, not the father. Step 2, the projector exerts pressure on the recipient to behave in the way that is congruent with the projector's fantasy. Unlike in a dyad, the psychological pressure exerted on groups of people, the masses in mass incarceration, is done so through the creation and maintenance of traumatogenic conditions. To illustrate this, let's take those boys that Mr. Hawkins talked about. And just a caveat, this is not a strengths-based formulation of these kids that I'm using as an example, and it's meant to highlight harms. It's not, I'm not holding in mind, and we should all be holding in mind that, of course, people have strengths and are multidimensional. Okay, so first, these boys, they're born Black in America. That alone gives them a 1 in 3 chance of spending at least a year of their lives in prison. Second, they're growing up in a violent and traumatogenic neighborhood where our collective contempt for them is shown to them every day. They're likely suffering from symptoms associated with post-traumatic stress, grief, loss. They attend carceral schools that socialize them to institutional life. Despite being born whole, human, and surviving hundreds of years of efforts to undo their humanity and their actual existences, they're constantly being interpolated as criminals. From the white woman crossing the street when they round the corner, to watching the police shoot people that look like them, these boys see themselves being seen by others. They grow up in a capitalist neoliberal culture like all of us, where success and worth is measured by things. Their legal access to such things is limited by low wages, high costs of housing and other basic goods, and racial bias that dramatically limits their equal access to education, employment, and the intergenerational accumulation of wealth. They have to want, but they cannot have. Racism is relentless and chronic stress is constant. Families are decimated. Drugs and alcohol are abundant, even in the most barren of food deserts. These conditions pressure people in them to feel all of the things that neoliberal conditions disavow: dependence, desperation, and need. When people find ways of coping with these feelings, and God forbid actually expressing them, they are the problems, not responding to the problems. Of course, as individuals, these boys also have personal agency, are resilient, and often resist. But even resistance can take on a topsy-turvy logic in traumatogenic conditions. Sociologist Victor Rios writes about the resistance identities among the disenfranchised at-promise Latinx boys with whom he works. He said the following about an incident in which a boy, Mike, and his friends were being racially profiled in a corner store that ended in Mike stealing a bag of chips, being arrested, and remanded to juvenile hall. Rios says, I asked Mike, why didn't you steal something more expensive? He told me that he thought about it, but in the moment, he didn't care what he took. He wanted to prove a point to the clerk, not to fuck with me. Despite facing further punishment, Mike and his friends felt that their actions were not in vain. They had won a small battle in a war that they were so tired of losing. One of the only resources that they had to feel respected within the system was to actively engage in behaviors that defied the rules of the game. As analyst Wilfred Bion describes, in the projective identification moment between two people, the recipient of the projections feels that they are, quote, being manipulated so as to be playing a part, no matter how difficult to recognize, in somebody else's game. Perhaps sometimes, end quote, perhaps sometimes flipping the game board over before the other person can win is worth losing the game yourself. Despite likely suffering the grief, worry, and anxiety that such truncated life horizons bring, boys like Mike are unlikely to be recognized as suffering. Instead, they are seen as objects of risk to be feared and punished. If they enact violence, their actions are seen as proof of the projections. This delinking of the individual and the environment, the psychological and the social, leaves them and us helpless. All we can do is incapacitate, and all they can do is resist. And finally, step 3. The recipient experiences himself in part as he is pictured in the projective fantasy. It is one thing to deprive people of liberties and goods and life chances, but to create conditions that then put the responsibility for those deprivations inside them, a twist of the knife. Thinking back to Mr. Hawkins, instead of seeing him and his life choices, however problematic, in the context of traumatic adaptations to extremely demanding conditions, he's a criminal, simultaneously a frightening perpetrator and a needy loser, both undeserving of our help and helplessly dependent. Relegated to this role, Mr. Hawkins exclaims, I'm a systems baby, and just wants what he has been told he is coming. Living in a topsy-turvy world where stabbing someone is the Catholic thing to do, he does his best to hold on to some sort of humanity while playing the part of bad and needy object. Despite essentially coercing him through systematically limiting his life chances, refusing to recognize his strengths or invest in him as a person, and then saddling him with the effects of traumatogenic conditions, we see him as embodying dependency, need, and perpetration. He is a criminal and all of those things, so that we who are not criminals can be none of those things. I once worked with a person who was out on parole after 40 plus years in prison for a horrific murder. The countertransference of the parole agents who supervised him was totally uncontained, and they just punished him relentlessly. They just could not get a handle on their own feelings about his commitment offense. This person, my client, really struggled with this. He understood the gravity of what he had done. He was horrified by it, and he understood other people's feelings about his crime. But he also knew through the work that he had done that his crime had been the culmination of years and years of trauma that he had endured. He had never been able to access help he needed as a victim until, cruelly for him, but most cruelly for his victim, he became a perpetrator and then went to prison and sort of had to make sense of this stuff and had a space to do it. They hate me now, he said, but where was everyone when I needed them? Freud said about criminals that the guilt precedes the crime. What if, in light of this projective identification process, the punishment precedes the crime? Okay, so I could stop for a moment if anyone has questions, or Marcia, comments or anything.
Does anyone want to ask a question? You can raise your hand. You can send me put a question in the chat. Okay, so the message I'm getting is please keep going.
Okay.
So please
okay,
continue.
Great. Okay, all right. So just one more section. Okay. So now we'll just say a little bit about the implications. So I guess in the what is that called? It's not an epitaph. That's an epigraph. I think the beginning of the interpretation of dreams, Freud had this this quote from the Latin that translated to, "If I cannot bend the higher powers, I will stir up the lower depths." And apparently he meant this to capture his kind of pessimism about making structural level changes, and that, like, you know, working at the level of the unconscious individually was kind of the way to go. So I'm a social worker. We like thinking in a both and kind of way. So I'm going to take the if then out and just say, let's do both. So thinking about bending the higher powers and stirring up the lower depths. Okay, so the value of thinking about the function of a symptom is that it helps us to make meaning of it, to understand the resistance to resolving it, and to anticipate what psychological or developmental work the person or people will have to do to be able to relinquish it. I always think about when I first started working in the prison, I had this patient who had a really severe mental illness. And I worked on the acute psychiatric unit for a while. And he came into the acute unit after a suicide attempt um, by, by trying to inject HIV infected blood into his arm as a way of committing suicide. And going back to, like, how else do you understand prison without psychoanalysis? I thought, like, wow, like, that's so interesting. Like, why of all the ways, why that? And I thought, and there's like another guy walking around here that's got a vial of HIV infect, and then they found each other. Like, that's amazing. But it was interesting in the institution that, like, there's a real push to, like, not make meaning out of anything. And if something feels unbelievable, it's just that somebody's trying to get over. So this idea that symptoms have meaning is such a helpful way to sort of like make sense of trauma, and to kind of get to work in helping people figure out how to get unhooked from whatever they're dealing with. Okay, so I'm just going to talk briefly about three different approaches we might take to mass incarceration in light of its function as a symptom. Okay, so first, we need to think about mass incarceration not just in terms of crime control, but as a symptom unique to the United States. As analysts Devoine and Gaudelet argue, in psychoanalysis, the symptom is always a message addressed to the other. From this perspective, the phenomena that our nation's prisons call upon its witnesses, that's us, to listen to is to really listen to what it's communicating. What does it mean about us that we're willing to incarcerate millions and millions of our community members, sentence people to die in prison, make prisons into places that reenact suffering, extract labor, break up families, and deny opportunities for healing, and not mourn that we're doing this for to each other? What does it mean that it's not enough to take time away from people as punishment, but that punishment has to be so punitive and so unending, even beyond prison? Is no one allowed to change or resolve trauma or repent? And if not, what does that say about us and our collective capacity? What does it mean about us as a country that we're so willing and able to find so many ostensible public safety reasons to keep Black and Brown people locked up, locked in, and locked out? As Lynn Layton states, quote, "In a psychoanalytic frame, which recognizes no possibility or desirability of overcoming dependence, the task is to comprehend the psychic effects of a cultural lack of attunement to dependency needs and a cultural encouragement to split off and project dependency needs and vulnerability," end quote. What would our society look like? And maybe more importantly, what would we all feel like if we were encouraged to normalize our dependency on each other and our social institutions? And I know that this is like a big ask that's not just specific to mass incarceration, it's cultural. I always think it's so interesting when, like, I would say more than half of people that come to me for therapy come because they want to, like, stop feeling all their feelings. And then you have to kind of like break the bad news that therapy actually, like, means that you feel more. So it's a lot to kind of like normalize these things. Might we feel and behave differently when a person who is poor, say, loses her job and needs money to pay rent for a year while she accumulates enough wealth to catch up and get out in front of the endless stream of costs that living requires? If we could see ourselves in her instead of having to fear becoming her, might we treat her from a place of mutuality and not disavow? What if when we saw those boys already in prison, we saw boys who were trying to be good little capitalists and their efforts called up in us an identification with them? Would we do something besides lock them in little cages? Instead of seeing crime and criminalized behavior as the not me parts of the self, can we see it as an expression of the there but by the grace of God go I part of our human experience? How different could this conversation about mass incarceration be if we developed our reparative capacities and could contain our culpability related to slavery and colonization? If we were able to hold each other accountable for our aggression, destructiveness, and the ways that we can experience both pain and pleasure by dominating other people? What would it require of us, and what would we have to require of each other and our institutions to be able to do so? What if we, as political scientist David MacGyver suggests, embraced the practice of civic mourning and cultivated our collective capacity to register the harms done and mobilize to repair them? What might happen if all of us really wanted to be able to feel, as Melanie Klein says, is crucial to kind of being able to repair our destructiveness or develop our reparative capacity? Um, what if we were able to feel that our love is stronger than our hate, and we're willing to avow our violence, take back our projections, and atone? How might the quintessential psychoanalytic stance of curiosity, which seeks to know, to understand, to keep building the equipment that you need to be able to bear emotion and bear experience, could replace the logics of carcerality, which seek to subjugate, disown, and disappear? Okay, and second, so the picture on the left is a picture from CMF, a prison where I worked, and this was somebody doing group therapy. And then in the middle, I don't know how many of you are looking at your screens, but one side it says not trauma informed, and the other side says trauma informed. And you could basically, like, I don't know, take every mission statement of a prison and then see all of the not trauma informed side. Okay, so second, we need to position ourselves and our colleagues to do really good transformative work with people who are on the receiving end of this process. If we really register the ruthlessness of our projections into the people in the justice system, then we're more likely to expect that our treatments will be complex. We should expect them to be hard and demand what we need in terms of time, space, and cost that treatment requires. We need to move beyond behavioral models that seek only to quell symptoms and insist on opportunities for deep, humanizing, capacity building work. We know a lot about how to treat many of the problems for which we've come to rely on prisons to disappear. We know that prisons are repositories for trauma and have so much good theory and research on how to address such suffering. And all of our theory and research tells us that trauma gets reenacted until it gets transformed. What if we took everything we know about the horrors of mass incarceration and poured all that outrage into fighting for opportunities to really invest in people and give them a real chance? As a lifer that I once worked with said to me, not just to get out, but to really get free. I'm thinking of a person with whom I just started working, an African-American, cisgender, disabled straight woman in her 60s. She came to see me because of a paralyzing fear that someone would find out that she had been to prison for committing a very violent crime. Over the course of a few sessions, she worked out some of her anxieties and decided to disclose her past to a trusted friend who responded with warmth, compassion, and acceptance. Instead of feeling relieved as she expected, she fell into a deep depression. We came to understand that it was only when the source of these harsh and punitive judgments was revealed to be in her and not in everybody else as she was imagining, that this brought her into contact with this overwhelming guilt and agonizing shame about her commitment offense. Years in prison had contained her guilt in as much as she was being punished, but freedom, life on the outside, an ordinary little life, she wasn't so sure she deserved that. This led us to a protracted exploration of the crimes she thought she'd come to terms with and a trauma history that she is just beginning to be able to bear knowing she has after 30 years in prison. How many billable hours will it take? How many should be allotted to grieve the life that she took, the life taking a life took from her, the life she lost to trauma, the life she lost to the life she served in prison? Who gets to quantify that? Whose lives count as lives? Who counts as human? What makes for a grievable life? And then third, this formulation also points us to the problem of the projectors. In a clinical situation, when a patient relies on projective identification, it's often understood as an effort to get the clinician to register something, to feel something that is unbearable to the patient. The therapist uses and their own experience to understand this unbearability and then work to help the person take back the projections. My colleague Ryan Parker, in her paper, Slavery in the White Psyche, explores the ways that white supremacy is both a social structure and an intrapsychic one. If we assume that the history of violent colonization and slavery in this country is a legacy into which all white people are socialized, can we understand whiteness as relying on a particular psychic structure that works against knowing itself? How might we understand and maybe even treat the cognitive distortions or even antisocial behavior of what we now think of as Karens, of white people who feel threatened by Black people who jog, sleep, birdwatch, babysit, work, don't work, go shopping, worship, live, or breathe? How can we understand the willingness we seem to have to mandate lots and lots of Black and brown people to treatment for their own good and not see the deadly acting out of white people as also a public safety threat? Why hasn't, and I know I'm ranting a little bit here, but why hasn't someone mandated Jeff Bezos to treatment? He makes $149,553 a minute. Like, that's like, does anyone think that that's like weird? Like, no one needs that much money. Like, why isn't that thought of as like pathological? I mean, there's nothing like even in the DSM that can like get him in the book. And there's lots of examples like that. Did anyone mandate the Flint water crisis people to treatment? You know, like these people that are part of these like white gang sort of militia things. Like, do we send them to treatment to work on their distortions? Not usually. I work with a woman who was incarcerated for 3 decades after committing a horrific crime. The first time we met, I'm concluding now. The first time we met, I learned about her history, her childhood trauma, her decades in prison, and how she did her time. I noticed a resistance on my part to asking her about her commitment offense, which made me curious about what might be being communicated unconsciously between us. So in this session, I thought I should give her a choice, and I asked her if she wanted to tell me about the crime she committed that, got her the life sentence, or if she preferred that I read her file. She nodded that she'd rather me do the latter. So and when I read her file after she left, I understood why intuitively I was trying to shield us both from knowing what she had done. The crime she committed was agonizingly horrific, and I wondered how she had gone on living, like really living, while bearing her culpability for it. It just still am amazed that she has managed to like take full responsibility for this and still keep living. When I saw her the following week, I told her that I had read her file, and her eyes welled up with tears. Mine did too. Before I could speak, she cleared her throat, sat up straight, and steeled herself. "I want to apologize to you," she said. I began to interrupt her, but she waved me off, clearly needing to speak. "I want to apologize to you for what I did," she said. "I know that you don't know me, and you didn't know any of my victims, but now you have to know what I did. It's in your mind, and I'm sure it's affecting you. And for that, I'm sorry." Analyst Wilfred Bion once said, "In psychoanalysis, when approaching the unconscious, that is, what we do not know, we, patient and analyst alike, are certain to be disturbed. In every consulting room, there ought to be 2 rather frightened people, the patient and the analyst. If they are not both frightened, one wonders why they are bothering to find out what everybody already knows." If we want to continue to rely on mass incarceration, then we don't have to bother to find out what we already know. 2.3 million people in our nation's prisons and jails and counting. But if we're willing to be disturbed, able to be frightened, and figure out how to know what we have done and what we continue to do, we might be able to find out something new, how to transform our country's trauma instead of relying on our prisons to reenact it. Thank you.
Beth, that was a great talk.
Thank you. Thank you.
Turn your mute and clap for a minute. That would be fun.
Thank you.
But
Very kind.
I'm getting many enthusiastic comments in the chat.
Thank you.
Philippe, I have a question from Dr. Bourgois, our center director. Philippe, do you just want to ask the question yourself?
Sure. Thank you so much. This has been really moving and inspiring
Thank you.
as such a powerful application of bringing psychoanalytic thought to address
Philippe,
really.
you need to turn your volume up. We're not.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
It's okay.
Oh, no, I just have to
Oh,
move
that's fine.
my microphone in front of my mouth. I'm sorry, I was so klutzy.
It's okay.
And I'll show my face too. Sorry about that too.
It's okay.
So thank you so much for addressing this central crisis in our society. And I wanted to ask you, and this is, this is a very Marxist question because that's the theory that I work with primarily. And it's also a psychoanalytic question. It's my central anxiety. How psychoanalysis is a powerful way of thinking, and it makes so much sense to understand trauma specifically. But how your analysis keeps bringing us back to hyper incarceration of Black men, to the structural forces of political economy in very concrete ways, and racism specifically. And I wonder if you could help sort of clarify how, in a practical way, the logistics of, the very individual, intimate logistics and sort of expensive in terms of labor logistics of psychoanalysis could be massified to address a politically, economically driven structural force that needs to be fundamentally transformed so clearly. And sorry for my long question, and thank you so
Oh,
much
no, it's okay.
for your
Oh, sure.
perspective and your ethnographic way of doing your clinical work and thinking about it.
Thanks. I think, and I might be like embarrassingly oversimplifying your question, but do you mean like taking a kind of like micro level intervention of psychoanalysis and then thinking how it would affect more like macro level change?
I don't know. I just can't see how on some level the two can be resolved in all
Hmm.
honesty, and yet I can also on some level can't live without the logic of psychoanalysis to stay sane.
Right, right. Yeah, I was really
Personally.
excited when I first started learning about psychoanalysis and I found out that being neurotic was good. I was just like, yes, this is the best thing I've ever heard, that it's an achievement to be conflicted and to be kind of, yeah, going back and forth. I don't know, the thing that like lots of things come to mind, but one thing that really comes to mind is I mentioned my colleague Ryan Parker, who's a social worker and also an analytic candidate in Texas. And this research that she did with white people and how white people, I want to say, thought about slavery, but her research found that people couldn't think about it. And it was really interesting. She just presented her work recently, and every time I hear it, it makes me think about the ways that like whiteness operates to kind of like disappear itself. And so even all of our theories don't really help us to think about it as like an active present thing, so like in psychoanalysis, this is like from Celia Brickman's work. She wrote that book Aboriginal Populations in the Mind, where she talks about Freud's ideas being based in anthropological ideas of the 1800s that have since really been kind of like amended and discarded and everything else by anthropology, and that psychoanalysis hasn't caught up to that. And there's still this real emphasis that like um psychological health and like developmental achievement um comes when you achieve what is like this white middle class heteronormative cis sort of existence. So Ryan's work, I think, when she starts digging into like how there's all these things about being in that kind of position that make us unable to think about ourselves and the content of our minds, I think in a hopeful way sort of tips us into limitations of psychoanalysis that can then be corrected so that we can use them in a more effective way to be thinking about these bigger kind of structural issues that of which culture and positionality are part and parcel. So I don't know if that answered your question or if I just said something else near you.
No, that's thank you. It's
Sorry.
helpful. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. Okay, other questions? Don't be shy.
I had a quick question, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Hi, my name's Noelle.
Hi.
A student at Stanford, and I'm looking to do a research-based argument paper on the psychoanalytic effects of disenfranchisement as a result of mass incarceration on felons' view of American democracy and of themselves. And I was wondering if you had any recommendations in terms of research or reading, or just any general information you have for someone who's looking into that aspect of this topic.
Well, one person that comes to mind is Reuben Miller and his work on carceral citizenship. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but he writes about kind of like I don't know that he names subjectivity, but when I read his work, it feels to me like he's talking about the way that subjectivity is getting sort of like reworked for Black men. It's kind of building on Louis Vaquant's work, but I think he talks about it specifically in terms of reentry and the disenfranchisement that comes from that. And like I said, what he calls carceral citizenship. So he's the first person that comes to mind. And then the person that I cited a lot in this paper that I'm just a fan of is Lynn Layton. She wrote a book called, what is it called? Towards a Social Psychoanalysis, that has a lot of the papers that she's written over the years. And she has a whole theory on how neoliberalism has kind of created this sort of like contemporary subjectivity. And maybe combining those two things might be helpful to you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Justin Strong has a question. Go ahead, Justin.
Cool. Thank you so much for your presentation. This is really great. I'm a PhD student at Criminology, Law, and Society at UC Irvine. And this was really exciting because a lot of my dissertation work is actually trying to bring in a psychoanalytic lens into critical theories on punishment and the like. So this is really generative. And so if I just have a couple questions. One, you referenced mourning a couple times in your presentation, and I was curious to the extent that like notions of melancholia lend to thinking about punishment. I was interested in, if you've had any thoughts about how we may connect theories of the drive to punishment and incarceration. And then if I could afford just one more question, like how does pleasure work in this context with projective identification? How is that happening? And so how does this process allow to repeat itself using that framework of projective identification? And again, thank you so much. And I would love to continue having these conversations as well.
Yeah. I feel excited to read your dissertation, and thanks for writing it when you write it, of course. So let's see, a lot of things popped into my head. I mean, in terms of the ways that this can repeat itself, I think that's what's different about projection and projective identification, because projective identification can hook up with something that it can get insubstantiated. And I think that's sort of like, for me, the cruelty of this is that it's not just like, people thinking bad things about other people and treating them that way. It's then creating conditions that then like nudge people along that way. And I think that's what's so, it's an understatement to say whiteness is complicated, but the like collision of intrapsychic stuff with all of that being made into institutions that then create that, I think is part of how that process just keeps itself going. And then I think, trauma does that too. Like there's a way that trauma just has a tendency to repeat itself because of, if you're kind of pushed into being in a place of having to make adaptations to trauma, generally those adaptations work to help you in one way, but then tend to undermine you in another way. And if the ways that they undermine people in those other ways are ways that we can keep criminalizing, then you can keep making more trauma and then make more adaptations and make more trauma. So I think one of the things that I've come to appreciate, which I guess is what got me thinking about this in this collective way, is just it's so overdetermined. It's like when in clinical work when somebody talks about like the pain of having this stupid symptom that they hate so much it won't go away, and you just realize there's like multiple things that are holding it in place, which I think goes back to the first question of like why this is so hard to change, and why like I hope that by starting to see people like Mr. Hawkins as not just like individuals who are making individual choices with their antisocial thinking, you know, really starting to conceptualize that in a different way might just help us to hold more of kind of the determinants to this. And then the pleasure part, I mean, so my colleague that I mentioned, Ryan Parker, she just presented her paper, Slavery in the White Psyche, along with this other colleague of mine, Daniel Butler, who's a PhD student in Santa Cruz. He writes a lot about this. And we were talking about how part of what I found so helpful about Ryan's work was her analysis of the ways that for white people, it was very hard to make contact with the possibility of being a perpetrator. Like she would ask people, well, what do you think it was like to grow up in a slave owning family? And everyone would talk about either not answer the question or talk about what it would have been like to be an enslaved person. Like people could not hear the question, or would do something to it. So I was saying like, yeah, like the pain of perpetration is just hard to bear. And Daniel said, yes, but the pleasure. So then there's this whole world of kind of anti-Blackness studies and Afro-pessimism that like there's pleasure in domination, you know what I mean? And I think that's why notions of white fragility and white guilt are like not helpful, because they don't account for the pleasure, you know what I mean? And ironically, I've actually learned, I feel like I've learned more about perpetration, pain, and pleasure from the folks that I've worked with who have gone to prison for murder and then worked their way out of that and finding some way to understand that. Like I feel like there's a lot of people who have figured out how to do this work that we can learn from. But those are just some thoughts. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure.
Deborah Myers, would you like to ask your question?
Thank you. Wonderful presentation. My question has to do with your patients and how they were allowed or encouraged to use psychoanalysis in their post-carceral self-development and personal growth. Did they have unique funding sources or a uniquely progressive prison? How did this happen?
Well, do you mean how has it happened that I have ended up working with people from a psychoanalytic perspective? Or
how these patients were allowed to have this type of treatment when all kinds of treatments and benefits are withheld?
Yes, right. Yes. So when I worked in the institution, I worked, so Coleman is a court case that many of you might be familiar with, where CDCR was sued for failing to provide adequate mental health care, and they haven't been able to get out of that lawsuit for like 25 years or something. So when I first started working in the institution, the courts had ordered, the receivers had ordered CDCR to set up this acute and subacute treatment program that was operated by DMH, and I worked there for 5 years. So that program for a while, we were able to do, it was really like clinically driven, and we were able to do like kind of longer term work. So people could stay for like 2 to 3 years in that program, and that's really where I got into kind of understanding just how important like trauma work is, and really giving people a chance to like work through trauma, like develop some of the capacities that trauma undermines, et cetera, et cetera. And then ironically, or not ironically, the receivers came in to see that program, as they did periodically, and thought it was such a wonderful program and it was such a great program that more inmates should have access to it. So they decided to limit the length of stay to 90 days. So it did mean more people could access it, but obviously like it was a completely different program. And talk about mourning, Justin, that you brought up, like it was so heartbreaking. It was like one of like the heartbreaks of my life, because I saw people work through stuff, and I saw people kind of get better in a really powerful way. And then, you know, in 90 days, you just can't do that kind of work. And then where I work now is the little known parole outpatient clinic. So oddly enough, in every parole office in the state of California, there's clinical social workers, and we do mental health treatment, and this is the kind of treatment I do. So.
Thank you. It is such a wonderful thought to imagine that we would allow proper long-term treatment for people who have been hurt for so long.
Yeah, I remember years ago someone saying, like, we act like poor people can't afford an unconscious, you know, that like somehow like this kind of work, you know, people can't make use of, and everybody can. So thank you.
Richard Spiegelman, you want to ask your question?
Sure. It's actually a follow-up, although I didn't know it when I wrote the question. And I was wondering what proportion of folks, either inside the institutions or on parole, who would like to work with someone like you get that opportunity?
That's a really good question. It's such an interesting question. I don't know how to answer it, because I don't know that a lot of people, I mean, first of all, I don't think there's anything like, I just want to make sure it doesn't seem like I'm saying there's something special about me. You know, like I think that there's something special about working psychoanalytically in a socially justice informed way, that I think sometimes people don't even know that that's possible. You know, like a lot of the focus on treatment is CBT. Like my favorite, I hear this all the time in CDCR, is the parole agents and other people will write, you know, subject will go to cognitive behavioral. Like they don't know what the noun is. You know what I mean? Like it's just cognitive behavioral, and that has just been used as like, I don't know, that's going to go do something, you know? So I think a lot of people really have had the experience of treatment being really different than what psychoanalysis can offer. So I think people would have to even know that it's available to then determine if it was something that felt right to them. But I will share just one anecdote that comes to mind. I remember working with this guy who was he had served a life sentence and he was out. He had done a lot of time, like almost 50 years. And his crime was pretty intense. And I remember having a lot of countertransference. And, you know, he came out, was real like deer in headlights. And he said he really needed to work on some stuff around his crime because it was coming up for him again now that he was out, and blah, blah, blah. And I remember just having this thought of like, oh God, I don't want to have to go there. Like, this is just going to be unbearable. Like, I don't want to do it. And he started talking about this pastor that he was in touch with, that he was going to be meeting with. And then I felt this surge of hope, like, oh, maybe he'll decide to work with the pastor, you know? So he comes back like a week or two later, and I said like, oh, how'd it go with the pastor? Like hoping that he would decide that he wanted to work with the pastor. And he said to me, like, I want to work with you. And I asked why. And he said, because you know I'm not okay. Everybody keeps telling me that I'm okay, and I know I'm not okay, and I need someone who gets that I'm not okay. So I think there is something about like bearing, and this goes back to Justin, your question, which I'm sorry I didn't answer, about mourning. Like it's just a lot, like the stuff that lands people there, that happens while people are there, like it's a lot. And I think the sturdiness that a psychoanalytic practice can bring, I think is helpful to people. And it requires a lot of mourning for me to tolerate too. But yeah, that's the best I can do to answer your question. Sorry.
Helpful. Thank you. Thanks so much.
Lori Hart, you could ask a question if you want.
Hi, thank you for this amazing presentation. Really, really appreciated it. Two of the points I want to sort of follow up on the scaling up question again, although we can all see the incredibly powerful way in which the work that you've done on a psychoanalytic plane would be valuable for everybody, short of everyone getting in-depth treatment. I'm trying to sort of wrap my head around how can some of this have any impact on a larger scale. So there were two areas in which I thought you were particularly powerful. And the first was just this whole kind of structure of denial that you were talking about. the denial of white people, obviously, to be able to mourn, to be able to feel the violence that has been perpetrated. And then the second one was a little different. I'll get to that in a second. But on that level, I'm wondering whether, in terms of thinking about the way that people can move into a sort of recognition of their crimes, so to speak,
Mm-hmm.
you have had any insights from looking at the movement of some white supremacists out of white supremacy? Like, I'm thinking of
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you know Ingo Hasselbalch's memoirs. There was years ago he wrote something in the New Yorker and has also come back on the scene, ex-Nazi in Germany. Whether there's any insight to be gained from those kinds of testimonies, and whether what you've learned from working with incarcerated men gives you a clue as to what allows them to, move out of the denial, and whether, sorry, this is a little bit long, whether there's a scale up that you can imagine in terms of people modeling that. I'm thinking also some of the Republicans who are repenting right now.
Yeah, right.
That's my first question. And the other one is the other one is really quick, and that is just, I just loved your reprioritization of what constitutes the pathological and the violent, and especially the model of Jeff Bezos. That was just, just laughing at this end. And I'm wondering, on the same point, how can we scale up a recognition of what violence is and does it, and what pathology is? I know you can't answer either one of those questions because they're so huge, but how inspiring it is to think along those lines.
I mean, I do think like thinking is an intervention, and I think I reference this, but Bion, who's like the analyst that he basically says, like, you don't actually think a thought until there's something that is unthinkable, and then you have to develop the I think that there is something about, if you just can sit with all these things being true and can't figure out how to put them together, there's an invitation to make some things not true and collapse. And then there's the invitation to make equipment, you know what I mean? And I think there is something about trying to understand how these things kind of come together that maybe can generate theories about that are scalable and things like that. But the other thing that comes to mind, which is maybe more related to your first question, is Melanie Klein. She's the person that developed the idea of projective identification. And, she really thought we were born with this aggressive drive, which, I mean, I believed, but after having twins, I was just like, dag, how could you not believe in an aggressive drive after having toddlers, But anyway, so she talks about how at some point, we keep things split apart, right? Because it makes it easier to feel loving feelings towards, you having a mom you love and a mom you hate. And then at some point you realize they're the same person and you get super scared. And that the only way that you can tolerate knowing that they're the same person and that you can feel love and hate towards the same person is if you believe in your capacity to repair the harm that your hate does. You know what I mean? And so she talks about this reparative capacity as developing as a normal development, but that can get really interfered with. And one of the ways that she talks about reparation is distinguishing between real reparation and manic reparation. And manic reparation is when you try and make someone feel better, but you sort of still hold them in contempt. Whereas real reparation is that you feel like a loss to your own sense of self because of your destructiveness. You know what I mean? And I think of that as the difference between oh yeah, it's so terrible what's happening to Black people, and shit, this is me, this is us, what are we doing? So in this weird topsy-turvy way, I think people have to start feeling it as in our own psychological self-interest to deal with this stuff. You know what I mean? And I think that even if people are doing that in spaces that seem disconnected to the criminal justice system, that's eventually going to change. There's just not going to be as much psychological fuel for these things. Did that answer anything? Oh, sorry. Okay.
Okay, any other questions? Okay, many enthusiastic comments. This is great. Several of you have asked if there will be a recording. Yes, there will be a recording. There is a recording of this talk. It's being recorded as we speak. And we will be posting this to our social medicine website. I can't give you the link for this right now. It's currently under construction. However, I'm going to give you my email. Listen carefully. Or look in the chat. If you just click on the chat, it's in the chat. MLYNNMEL, mlynmel@gmail.com. If you email me, I'll send you the link.
And Marcia, it shouldn't, I mean, we will be having, the links to these on our website, on the social medicine website somewhere.
Yeah, it is it will be on the social medicine website.
So if you forget the link that Marcia had, I mean, you can always just go to the social medicine website and find it that way.
Right. You can also look, just look for UCLA social medicine.
Yeah, there'll be drop downs.
There'll be drop downs.
Now, though, our website is embarrassing. It's in reconstruction and it's incomprehensible, and half the links are broken, and we apologize.
So if you
but it's in the process of being redone.
By all means, email me. And thank you so much for coming. The next talk we have definitely scheduled will be on January 29th on the poverty industry. I hope many of you will join us for that. And Beth, thank you. That was a really, really wonderful.
Thank you so much for having me.
It was a great pleasure. Take care, everyone.
Okay, bye.